So let's talk about food. What did ancient Israelites eat? Well, somewhere between 50 and 70% of their calories were from bread. You had a very bread heavy diet. You ate bread at every meal because grain was cheap and plentiful and you could store it. Of all the crops they raised, things like figs and grapes and olives weren't going to keep. Olives got converted to oil, grapes got converted to wine, which would keep, but the fruit stuff didn't keep very well. So grain was the staple food, and you ate a lot of grain. Typically, it was stored in clay jars or silos in the rock they would make that they could put their grain into. A typical meal, you had bread. They baked bread usually once a week because fuel for a fire was very difficult to find. Their wood was tremendously scarce. For instance, in Jerusalem, they often lit their cooking fires with clippings from grapevines and olives because that was the only wood they could come up with. In Galilee, a lot of cooking was done with dung. So before you cooked, you had to go out and collect enough dung or whatever to make your fire. So they baked once a week. To keep the bread from getting moldy, they would set it up on the roof and let it dry. So the bread you got was hard. It wasn't nice, fresh Wonder Bread like we have. So to eat it, they would dip it in some kind of liquid. So that could be a stew like of lentils. Lentils were a popular part of the diet. They dipped it sometimes in wine, vinegar, even water was used for that. But your bread was hard, and it was made in little rolls, sort of like a dinner roll. The oven you baked bread in, one particular kind was sort of this round dome, and you built a fire in it, and you stuck the pieces of dough to the outside of this, and then they cooked right on the surface of the oven. So that's what your bread looked like, cooked with dung. So I don't know what a dung fire smells like, but I can't imagine that it smells good and that the scent of it would get into your bread. So since they ate so much bread, grinding grain was a big part of the daily routine. Villages, bigger towns had bakeries, but in villages, a woman would cook her own bread, and you would spend hours grinding the grain. All these ancient villages, where they excavate them, you find little hand mills. Some of them are round that turn. Some of them are a big rock with another one that goes over it, and over the years, they've sort of scooped a depression out of the rock. But that was one of the big tasks for a woman with a family that you might spend your whole morning on, is just grinding grain. So the women in those days were buff. You also, because your grain was ground on stones, there was a lot of grit in it. And skeletons from that era often have their teeth really worn down from all the grit that was in their bread.